All right, this is awesome. It's so great to see everybody this morning. Such a great packed house. And yeah, like Lee said, normally I'm just out in my beehive, so if you ever want some honey, reach out. But today I won't bore you about bees, although I could later if you want me to. Instead, I want to talk about a new idea that isn't really new at all, but I'm going to call it new, so hopefully you get more excited about it, called Universal GraphQL. So first, I'm James. I work at Apollo. I'm an open source developer, which means that I get to spend most of my time actually working on open source software, which one is just a really incredible thing, but also it helps me to stay informed and excited about what's going on in the community. And recently, my big focus has actually been about Apollo Client 2.0 and how can we take what we've learned with the 1.0 and improve it and make your apps better and faster. And we've been working on it for a few months now, and it's getting pretty close to be ready for release. And as we worked on it, we started to realize that there was a lot of new opportunities with it that you couldn't do with 1.0. And a lot of that learning has actually helped to inform this talk and the idea of using GraphQL everywhere that you manage any kind of data. So it's helped to kind of inform the idea of universal GraphQL in practice. So guys, what is a universal GraphQL client? And so with Apollo Client 2.0, what we want to have is a way for you to manage all of your data. So if you're unfamiliar, if you haven't been following along with the release candidates or the betas and then the broken betas and then the fixed betas, Apollo Client 2.0 is 4 big changes. One is it takes the network stack and it completely makes it customizable. So there's a composable network stacks that use a project called Apollo Link, which is, I think, a really, really amazing project. It allows for a modular cache. So depending on the shape of your data and what you're doing, you can kind of fine-tune that cache to be as performant as you can. So if you have like really, really large data sets but don't do a lot of mutations, and you can really focus on near instant reads, or if you're actively making a lot of optimistic updates and mutations, then maybe you want to have a quicker write system. It's a faster runtime. Our benchmarking has it around 5 times the speed of the Apollo Client 1.0 release. And it's a smaller package. It's actually about half the size of the 1.0. And part of that was making it modular, but the other part was also just improving some of the way that we did code sharing and reducing things that weren't necessary anymore. So we've learned a lot building Apollo over the past few years. And I've been part of the project since it began, but most recently joined the team this summer, actually. And so when we were evaluating why we needed to rewrite something or like make an improvement, making a decision for 2.0 is not something that we take lightly. So we had to think, like, why are we actually going to do this? What is it about GraphQL and that we're not taking advantage of right now? It really comes down to this idea that GraphQL is about describing your data, right? You want to be able to just say, this is what I'm looking for, and then go ahead and make it work. So GraphQL is the language of your data. It's about describing your data requirements and then allowing the code to fulfill them to trust to be able to fulfill it. So it's an adjustment from the REST mentality, which is I want this general set of data, and then the server just gives me everything that they think that I'm going to need. And it moves that idea over to the client to say, this is exactly what I need for my UI or for my application purposes. So I'm going to describe it, and then I just expect you to fulfill it for me. It's a really, really good assistant, essentially. So it's a descriptive language to go between your client and your server. And so it's really cool. Like if you look on the left of the slide here, you can see a GraphQL query. And fun fact, this is actually the query one of the queries that powers Engine, which is a new product that we launched yesterday. If you want to learn more about it, you can go to the garage and they'll show you it. But the idea is I want to describe my data and then I want to get it back in the exact same shape. So there's no unnecessary fields. It matches what I wrote exactly. You can use things like alias to even rename and remap on the fly, which is a really, really powerful thing. It also is really great because if you can use static descriptions, and then there's a way to have dynamic execution of it. So using things like variables and directives, you can take runtime information and apply it to your data, but you can still get all the benefits of static queries. You get better dev tooling. You can have better security support for it. You can like send those over to your server and say, if you don't see this query, then just reject it because it's somebody else. So GraphQL ultimately is really great because it lets you to describe your data and your data requirements and then just trust that it gets fulfilled. So then we're thinking, okay, yeah, this is great. We all know this. We're all really excited about it here. That's why we're all here. So where are we right now? And this was this summer. So we have Apollo Client, which is really great for web use and for React Native applications. Essentially, it's a JavaScript client. So anywhere that you can run JavaScript, you can run it, which is pretty exciting. But the idea is you bind data to your UI. We also have Apollo iOS and Android, so if you're writing native clients, then you can use those. So taking the same idea of a normalized cache and using the type system and moving that into your native code base. And then we have GraphQL tools along with Apollo Server, which makes building GraphQL servers really easy. And GraphQL tools really just makes building a way to execute a GraphQL query really easy. It isn't necessarily limited to just a server. But even something like GraphQL tools, it takes the idea of describing the data that you want to show instead of request, and it turns that into your application. So you're using the schema definition language here to generate your application, because it's more about being able to easily understand and explain what's going on. So that's really great, but ultimately what we were seeing is we had kind of limited ourselves to the idea of just like innovating and replacing what we were doing with our existing REST APIs. But what we were missing out on was the idea of providing a really clean way to tell your application what data you needed and then piping together a source for it to resolve. So we stopped back and we're like, how can we actually start to expand that? What new opportunities are there? What are some new horizons that we can explore using just GraphQL as the way that we do it? And so like Lee mentioned, I actually was originally a designer. I studied architecture and art, and I got into software from a design standpoint. And when I approached all these things, and we see like our back-end teams loving building this, and our front-end teams loving using it, and I talked to my peers who are designers, and they're really frustrated because they have like 1,000 pictures of cats on their computer that they use to mock up stuff. And they're just kind of like missing the whole point. Maybe I have weird friends. Maybe they don't all use cats. But the idea is like, hey, we're trying to design something for our users, but we don't actually know what our users are using. And so you get these situations where, like, unless you're Airbnb and you actually have beautiful places on your app, you're like, oh, look at this wonderful idea and this wonderful image, and then you actually see it in production, and you're like, ooh, this was like a really old phone, and it's really pixely, and that's no good. So what if we could actually design with real data? And what if we could make that really easy? And you don't want to necessarily have to have your design team become engineers, because that's wasting their potential. Instead, you want to make it really easy for them to select what they want to put into the UI and start to iterate on that design. And even you want them to be able to propose new ways to access things. So with GraphQL, you can focus on designing for real people. And so this is actually a shout out to Airbnb and specifically John Gold for React Sketch App. And it allows you to write React and to render it in Sketch to be able to keep a universal component library and to iterate on designs using React, which I think hopefully we all love. I know I do. So we're taking a look at that and we're like, well, what if we could actually use real data sources in Sketch? And ironically, using React Apollo's server-side rendering functions, we can render GraphQL data right into React app. So I don't know if we can get it back on the screen. There we go. So this is an example from the repo that uses Apollo Client. And it's using, I think, GraphQL as a service, and that's real data pulling from GraphQL rendered in Sketch. So you can actually move that layer and not just be a client-server negotiation, but actually move GraphQL early into your process. And with this, you can actually create production-ready design components. So it's not just how do I make this look, but this is the data that I want to be requested from the product-level team, from the design team, all the way to production with this kind of code base. And so you can kind of unify your entire team around GraphQL and something like React, and then you have your production data UI and your production data requirements paired together all the way from Sketch to the actual native app. Another really cool thing that you can do with something like schema stitching, which I'll get into a little bit later, is you can actually, and as well as using GraphQL Tools mocking service, is you can just start faking your data until you get to a point where you need it. So one of the issues that we heard was like, oh, GraphQL makes us so much faster, which is really, really great. We can iterate on products, we can just describe our data and we get it. But then our backend team is starting to really get mad at us because we're asking for all these new things over and over and over again because we're so far ahead of them. And we're like, oh, you're right. That's not a problem that we actually solve. That's the age-old problem that everyone still has. So the idea is, what if you could actually, as a front-end team, just describe what you wanted the data to eventually look like and mock on top of your existing server and use something like schema stitching or GraphQL Tools mocking to temporarily say this is what the schema is going to look like. Go ahead and build your front-end with it, and then eventually when the services team gets to it, then we just remove that mock portion. And so this is using Apollo Launchpad, which lets you actually write a GraphQL server. And you can actually use this to mock on top of your company's existing GraphQL app. So if you don't have access to server infrastructure, you can just borrow ours and write your app on top of it, and then just start building what you want to build. So that's really awesome. We can take what we're doing with GraphQL and even the traditional client-server request, we can move it further into our process. So our team universally uses GraphQL at this point, which is super exciting. But we're still just kind of stuck with like, okay, we have a client, we have some server that uses GraphQL, and that's really great, but what else can we do? So what does the tomorrow look like for GraphQL? So what if you could use different data sources? Ultimately, the spec is independent of how the data gets resolved. It just says, given this query, you should give back this result. So what if you could start to stream some of those results? What if you could say, like, all right, I want this bit of information, and I eventually want this, but like, don't make me wait on it. So we'll just wait until, just defer it for a little bit later. What if you could actually manage all of your application state? So instead of using something like Redux or MobX, you could just use GraphQL everywhere. What if you could use your existing REST endpoints or a third-party services REST endpoints because they haven't updated and moved to GraphQL yet? And what if you could just use data from anywhere? Like what are the possibilities here if we make it really, really easy to just describe your data and then you plug in a way to resolve it? So one of these ideas is like streaming server-side rendering. So React 16 came out with way better performance for server-side rendering because it allows you to actually stream your server render to your client, which is really great, but it kind of still has a limitation of you still have to resolve some data unless you're just rendering an app shell. So how can we make it really, really easy to render your data and your UI as fast as possible? And right now, React Apollo has a way to do server-side rendering that's really, really easy. It goes all the way down your tree, it finds any data source, it waits until they're resolved, it continues going down, and you get all of your data, and then you actually render your app. So it's being used in production by a lot of companies. It actually works really, really well, but we always want to try and make that faster. So what if, instead of doing a two-pass render, what if you could just say, all right, I want you to stream this React app over to the client. And you could expect that the render process is going to go down your tree, it's going to build your UI, and anytime it finds a data source that it's missing, it pauses, it gets that data, and then it streams it back. And what if the data source itself is actually streaming? And you want to say, after a given amount of time, if this doesn't resolve on the server, then just go ahead and send it over and pick it up later on the client. And so you can say, like, all right, I want to do a partial render, half of it on the server and the rest of it on the client, and it just worked automatically for you. So using tools like the defer directive that Lee actually announced a little while ago, or streaming, as well as React Apollo, you can actually start to get some of these benefits in GraphQL's tomorrow. Don't try it right now. And then what if you could use existing REST endpoints? So GraphQL is amazing with directives, and so what if you could start to write these client-side only directives? And you say, like, all right, I have an existing REST endpoint. It's at user's email, and given their email, you're giving back a user. But one of the issues with REST is you have these like waterfall requests that you have to manage. So you have to manage the loading state, the error state, the waterfall request, where you cache all that information. So when you're doing this, you have to build essentially a client, a data management client, to be able to do it. Instead, if you're already using Apollo, why not just use it? It has all the benefits. It has normalized caching. So what if you could just write at rest, and then you could take a break and just let it work? And you could even be able to use information to create waterfall requests, and it would just do it for you, where you do something like at provides, and you say, given the ID from that previous request, use it as the ID variable in this next request. And again, you can just quickly iterate on these ideas and use this in production with services that you don't control. So whether you want to do that on the client or do this on the server with GraphQL tools, both of them would be able to work. And then I think the one that makes me most excited is just accessing all of your data. Having worked and led a team of developers before, it gets kind of really hard to teach all of the different ways to manage data. It's like, all right, so you're new here. This is really great. React's pretty great. Like a lot of tutorials, just learn React and you can build our app. But if you want to use data, you got to do GraphQL. So you got to do queries and mutations. You've got to learn Redux. You got to learn Redux Saga so that you can do like chains of events. We have local component state. I don't really know when to tell you when to use it or when not to, but like hopefully you just kind of figure it out. And so then it's like the end of their first week, and they're like, I'm just going to go and try and like leave because this is too much. So what if we made it really easy and you said, yeah, you just write GraphQL. And then you just say, for this field, I want you to use, it's on the client. So just look to the client GraphQL execution and not to the server. And even better than that, what if you didn't have to write separate queries? Or it's like, well, this is my client query and this is my server query. What if you could inline them and you could just say this field or this selection set, bring it from the client, go ahead and resolve it, and then get the server response at the same time, merge those things together for me in my UI will update. Well, with Apollo Client 2.0, you can actually do that. You'll be able to do that. You can say, this is just GraphQL. That's how you manage data. You render with React, and you manage data with Apollo. And all these tomorrow events are driven by this idea of using the spec and not change, the spec doesn't need additions for us. It's incredibly powerful right now, but it's so new that we still haven't taken full advantage of it yet. And the spec allows for directives and kind of ad hoc directives as you want it, both on the client only, server only, or client to server usage. So something like skip and include exist as a really great example of how you can actually build these tools to make your app better. So we can take these directives, and we start adding our own. So you can just npm install this package that can handle a directive for you, and then you just improve what you can do with your data. So now that we can describe our data better and more specifically, like in the query we can say resolve it from here, this is REST data, this is client data, and then our servers or our response sections are still really good at resolving data. Like given this information, use a resolver and pull it from here. It's not something we all understand, it's just functions. But there's still a really big gap in between describing your data and resolve it. So what can we do to connect those dots? So there's 3 new ways that you can connect those dots. One is Apollo Link, one is with schema stitching, and then one is using Apollo Engine. So what is Apollo Link? Honestly, Apollo Link is the most exciting part about the 2.0 to me, even though I didn't get to work on it quite as much as I would have liked to, because it was just so well done. One of our team members, Evan Towser, wrote just an incredible way to describe data. And when I'm on a flight, I just write Apollo links because they're honestly fun and they can do so much. I'm also kind of weird, so I apologize. But Apollo links are about creating a component-based request chain. So it's about how do you control the execution of looking up data. And then there's going to be a lot of things that you want to do with that. You want to handle errors. You're able to do side effects like logging services. You want to be able to show a global loading state for all your operations going on at once. You may want to change the shape that gets back from the server or from another instance. So you could write this really, really long control function, which you could actually do with Apollo Client 1.0. It just was not very easy, and so no one did it. But what if you could have these individual components that says okay, if you ever see an error, just send that error to Sentry, and that's it, and then just keep going. And then you had another one that says, this is how I log in. And you just save that and you use it across all of your applications. Apollo Link actually lets you do that. It's the request primitive designed for the GraphQL age. So this is actually an Apollo Link. So this is creating an error handler. And all you do is say on error, and then given the error, do something with it. And then you just include it in your link, or in your Apollo client stack. And now it just works. And so you can see how little you have to write to be able to start to do some really powerful things. And you can reuse them everywhere. So what do you mean reuse them everywhere? What if you could actually use GraphQL to build GraphQL? Just kind of a little bit of a weird thing. It's very meta. But with schema stitching, you can actually do that. Given GraphQL microservices, you can say, pull this set of schema from this set of applications and this set from over here, and merge them all together into one schema so my client only has to look at one place. So the reality is this is actually available now with GraphQL tools, and you use Apollo links to make these requests. So if you have an application level error handler that you want to use for your service, you can use it on the client, and you can use it on the server to stitch together multiple schemas. Or maybe that you've shipped the GitHub API, where you need to make a pre-flight request to log in, and then you want to be able to add any kind of authentication header to the request itself. That works on the client and on the server or anywhere else you want to run it. Maybe it's a CLI that you're building. You can just save and install that npm, you can npm install that Apollo link, and then just start using it. Since it's able to return multiple responses, you can do asynchronous work really easily. And then you can stitch together success. So you can take the query on the left, which has the Ticketmaster Universe API, and then using Dark Sky API. And this just shows how I've manually wired them together on the left. I have my event, and then I have location. But the issue is I need to know the location from the event, because I don't actually know that. So instead, you can stitch together the schema on the right that uses the city name and passes it through schema stitching to that location resolver. So then the client doesn't need to know where the data comes from. They just are able to describe it, and it just works. And then the third step is Apollo Engine. And Apollo Engine is about unlocking your GraphQL so you don't have to. It can make your app faster. It can help you to understand what's going on with it. In the future, it can do a lot of things like providing batching or defers for you. That way you don't have to wait for your server to implement it, or you don't have to worry about it. So really, Apollo Engine is about helping you to understand and improve your GraphQL application. So it's a layer in your stack that sits between your client and your server, and it helps to fulfill those requests and provide you information about what's going on. So using Apollo Link and using schema stitching and using Engine, it helps you to not have to worry about how you resolve that data. You can go back to building your product by describing what you want and then just having it resolved for you. So this is really awesome. Now we've got GraphQL kind of like everywhere in our application. We're using it on our clients, we're using it on our servers, but where else can we go? I mean, JavaScript scarily runs everywhere right now. I try to, in every talk, give a shout out to Ken Wheeler for building a crossbow controlled with GraphQL. But now I can actually give a shout out too, because OKGrow has a golf ball that you can control with GraphQL in the lounge, so I highly recommend you go try it out and see if you can get a hole-in-one with mutation. So what if we could actually do like Internet of Things that we are doing in the lounge right over there? What if you could do peer-to-peer where you don't actually have a server, but maybe your phones connect to each other and use GraphQL as that language? Since it's more about describing and fulfilling what the data you're requesting, it's not necessarily about who's the client and who's the server. It's I'm asking for data and I'm returning it. It's a conversation about your data. What if you had Alexa that was powered and hooked up with GraphQL API, and you could ask it things like, hey Alexa, how is my app running on Engine, which has a GraphQL API itself? Or you could use a webhook and do a mutation and say like, and Alexa could warn you when your build failed on Travis, which I would not turn on because I would get warnings all the time. And like a crazy idea is, what if you built a GraphQL-driven package manager? You know, like package manager is about managing a dependency graph of what your app needs to build and run. So like, what if you use GraphQL to describe that, both on the file system and making those requests from something like NPM? So all of this is possible with Apollo Client 2.0, which is really, really close. And because we're all space themed, I try and like one small step for GraphQL and one giant leap for data. So we need to like actually release the 2.0 once it's ready to be able to do this. And actually, let's see. Yeah, okay, it's ready now. So let me just go ahead and do that. So let me real quick jump over here and here. Oh, okay, cool. There's a pull request built. And should we? All right. All right. So, like any good professional chef on a cooking show, I've prepared an Apollo Client 2.0 prior. Let me pull it out of the oven real quick. So it is actually already on NPM. You can install Apollo Client. It's been live since yesterday. So try it out and tell me what you think. All right, let me get back to the presentation. All right, so it is taken off. So thank you for listening to me today. This was a super big honor for me to be able to talk to all of you about GraphQL and things that I'm really passionate about and working on every day. And honestly, please come and join the fun. It's really easy to contribute. We have over 700 contributors have made the 2.0 and other Apollo products possible. So essentially, it's you. So thank you for helping to build GraphQL into what it is today, helping to build Apollo and make it really easy to use. It's super easy to get started. Just go to apollographql.com and you can figure out what you want to work on. And hopefully we can work together and ship some really amazing things. You can also find me at jbaxley III. I'm a third, but it's hard to write that. So you can find me kind of anywhere. I'm pretty active on Twitter and Medium. But thank you so much.